assassinations, kill heretics, destroy heretical works. So like books, like some of their jobs were to track down books that the Pope had deemed heretical, so they had to be burned. They would literally just go into towns and burn these books. And also to intimidate, to come in and coerce people to think or view or see or do the way the Pope wanted. And they truly embodied the phrase, the end justified the means. Now, with that said, I was speaking high level with that. If you go down, there's always exceptions. There were some of the Jesuit order that, quite frankly, were amazing in their service to the Lord and what they did. Some of them, one of them was Francis Xavier from 1506 to 1552. He was credited with helping literally hundreds of thousands become believers in Japan and India over his lifetime. So he focused on evangelism specifically. Matthew Ricci from 1552 to 1610 had a very, very large impact of Christianity within China, an area that at that time was really closed down to anything of that sort. Then there was a Pedro, I don't know how to pronounce that, Claver, from 1580 to 1654. This person, from everything I could read, was just amazing what this person did. This was a time where slaves were acceptable. Slaves were okay. You don't come against the slave system. That's how it is. He was fully and completely against the slave system, especially the African Americans. He fought very hard to try and break down that whole social system, basically the caste system of they're a slave. He tried to get them to be considered full members of churches. It doesn't matter if they're black. It doesn't matter if they're white. He was very much against racism in any kind. And he had a lifetime of helping slaves anywhere and everywhere he could. Anything from helping them to escape, to buying them, setting them free. I mean, literally anything he could do. And even in the times where he couldn't do anything, he would go to the docks where the slaves were, and he would preach to them the gospel, and again, help where he could. And unfortunately, like a lot of people, the end of his life was very sad. I won't go into the details, really, because what he accomplished is really amazing, and he got his eternal reward, in my opinion, again, based on what I read. I mean, he went through just horrible ordeals. He was fighting the system. And again, as a Jesuit, with all the bad things that the order did, this particular person, I was just blown away everything that he did to try and help people. All right, 1542, a couple years later, Denmark and Norway became Protestant. Also in 1542, the Inquisition was recommissioned by Pope Paul III. So this wasn't the first instance of it. And the goal of this one specifically was to stamp out Protestant. Wow, that's a big word. You're missing a page? Well, that's unfortunate. I guess you'll just have to try to follow along as good as you can. All right, so this Inquisition was recommissioned to stamp out Protestants, and this Inquisition was everywhere. But Spain was by far the worst, and that is the one that you actually usually hear the stories about when people are talking about the Inquisition. It's this particular time frame that they're usually talking about, and that's why I use the phrase they're infamous for it, because most people have heard of this Inquisition. And these were basically the statutes that the Inquisition followed. You were guilty until proven innocent. So if you couldn't prove your innocence, you were killed. You were never confronted with your accusers, so you didn't even know who did it. You were forced to testify against yourself, and sort of a sub-bullet of that, you were frequently tortured to extract a confession. Again, you're guilty until proven innocent. So they wouldn't try to, there was no benefit of the doubt, there was no tell your side of the story. It was to force you to basically confess, and so you confessed, right? They would normally still kill you anyway, even if you did confess. And of course, the punishment was normally loss of life, burning at the stake, or in a lot of cases, loss of liberty, although the loss of life was the more common one. They would just burn you alive. Very, very gruesome. 1543, Nicholas Copernicus published his theory of heliocentrism. And what that basically is, the earth revolves around the sun. And of course, prior to this, everybody believed that the whole universe revolved around the earth. The earth was the center of everything. So that included the sun revolving around the earth. However, because we're in this age of enlightenment, people were open to hearing more scientific ideas. And so even though, if he'd have come around 300 years ago, he'd have been pretty much, most likely been instantly killed as a heretic and superstitious and all that. But he was allowed to be heard. And even Luther had heard Copernicus speak from time to time. This particular person was arguably the most well-educated man in the entire world at this time. If there was a science, he was an expert at it. Very well learned, very good speaker. So not only intelligent, but he could relate his thoughts in a way that people could understand it. Which, as you know today, there's a lot of intelligent people that when they speak, everybody else goes, huh? He was able to put it in terms that everybody could grasp. So he would just mesmerize people with the way he would talk about science. And so this particular one, this theory of heliocentrism, it blew everybody's minds. Because think about that. That changes what people have literally been thinking for centuries at this point. Nobody had even considered that it was a different model than what they thought. So previously, Earth was it. It says in the beginning, right? Genesis. It's all about the earth. Everything's about the earth. And it does say that God created the stars and all that, right? In the scriptures. Well, now, all of a sudden, earth is just part of God's creation. There's more to his creation. And just for people to wrap their heads around that, they were stunned, for lack of a better phrase. Like even Luther literally didn't know what to think about it. Like he didn't call it bad, he didn't call it good. He was just like, wow, can't believe it. So that happened from a scientific point of view at that time. 1544, Iceland became Protestant, Lutheran. 1545, another Council of Trent began. This was a Roman Catholic council. And this was an attempt to reform or, quite frankly, fix the clergy within the Roman Catholic Church. Part of what Pastor Josh covered in the previous period, and then, of course, up until this point, 1545, in this period, there were massive problems with the Roman Catholic clergy. There was simony, which is essentially a figure, you're paying for your position. So you didn't earn it, you weren't voted, you did a favor or paid for it, that sort of thing. So people would get their positions through those means. Or as a priest or whatnot, luxurious living. You would live better than everybody else. And a big one was the concubines. So it had been said, if you're a priest, you can't get married, right? So they would all have these housewives. Or not even housewives, house servants. They were the maids. There were concubines, and everybody knew it. And so they were trying to combat that. And then on top of that, a lot of them, mostly because of the simony ones and ones that got in through other means, they didn't know a thing about the scriptures or how to teach them. And so people were very frustrated with that. And so the Roman Catholic Church was going to try and fix this. But also in this council, they declared that all Protestant doctrines were heresy. So it was a focus on the Roman Catholic clergy, as well as stating anything that's Protestant is wrong. And this particular council was not a meet and it was over. This council met, I think, for 6 or 7 years. So, it was a discussion. It wasn't just a week or a month. They met repeatedly over multiple years. And this effort did win many Catholics who had switched to Protestant. They actually came back to Roman Catholic because the whole problem was they had seen all of this corruption, if you will, in the Roman Catholic Church, and they didn't like it. So when they saw basically some of the clergy getting slapped on the hand, they were like, hey, this is good, so they went back. 1546, This is when Martin Luther died, just sort of as an FYI. 1553 to 1558. This is when Queen Tudor ruled England. She's a very famous leader. There's a lot of movies about her, and a lot of them aren't very accurate. She tried to switch the nation back to Roman Catholic, away from Protestant. She was fierce and extremely ambitious, and she was completely willing to use force. In fact, she was nicknamed Bloody Mary, even though, so everybody's probably heard that term, Bloody Mary. We don't know which queen it went to. Well, it went to this one, Queen Tudor. But here's the irony, if you will, and quite frankly, a little bit of sexism. She didn't do anything any worse than the guys before her. But she was the one named Bloody Mary. You know, all the kings before her could have been called, Bloody Henry, She did not kill more people or anything like that. It's just she got attention because she was a woman and was nicknamed Bloody Mary for what she did. Most specifically, I couldn't find a solid number on this. I saw anywhere from 250 to 350 people that she had burned at the stake by her order. So hence the Bloody Mary thing. But again, a lot of previous kings were doing this too. So it's not like she started it, but she was ruthless. This is, I actually don't say where she was from. I didn't write it down. I don't remember. It could have been. I do not remember where she came from. She ruled England, but I do not remember. I did not write down her origins. I forget. And her strong movement, as I mentioned there, it's from 1553 to 1558, so it's only 5 years. Why is it only 5 years? Because she died of health complications. So it's not because she was actually taken out or anything like that. Her body gave out on her. And it's not clear what it was, but it was something like a cancer or a wasting disease, that kind of, it's not very clear on what happened, but it was something like that. And because it was so quick, 5 years is not a super long time. She didn't really have a second that everything kind of went to, and she didn't have enough time for heirs as well. Moving along to 1550, Robert, I do not know how to pronounce that, Robert Estienne published the Stephanus Greek New Testament. He was born in France, and his last name in Latin was Stephanus, hence why it's called the Stephanus Greek New Testament. And this was written because the Erasmus Greek New Testament that was completed in 1522 and published had not been challenged for its authenticity. And so he challenged it. And he used new sources, so essentially different sources from what the Erasmus version used. He had 15 Greek Byzantine manuscripts that Erasmus didn't have that were considered authentic. He had something called the Complutensian Polyglot, which is another collection from a previous era that Erasmus did not have, which again was considered authentic. And if I remember right, that's actually still in a museum today. And then he had an additional 2 Alexandrian codices. So using these new sources, he re-examined the New Testament in Greek to see how accurate it was. And an exhaustive comparison proved that the Erasmus version was completely accurate. Yes, there was no error. And so that was this is a major effort to do a full translation. But that's why this translation in 1550 happened, is they were trying to re-prove that it was accurate, and it was. And even though they determined that the Erasmus version was fine, well, they keep doing reprintings. And so that's why it switched over to the Stephanus Greek New Testament, because they kept reprinting over time. And his was just simply the most recent one that had verified that it was accurate. But you think the two of them, Stephanus, Erasmus, they're the same. At least from what I've read. They said that they are the same. So there was no retranslation of the original text. And in 1551, again, multiple versions, multiple printing press copies. In a 4th edition, it added verses, which was the first time for verses. They had split into chapters at this point, but this was the first one with verses added. And it wasn't even the first version. It was a 4th edition of the Stephanus Greek New Testament. Now, this wasn't the first person to try adding verses. There was Asante Pagnino who tried a few years earlier, but the way that that person split the verses up were really long, and it was long enough that it just didn't stick. People didn't use it because there was too much information in a single verse. And so it didn't stick. And so the verses added in the Stephanus Greek New Testament that they really took. 7 years later, in 1557, Scotland converted to Protestantism, and Patrick Hamilton brought the first Protestant sermons to that area. And in 1528, he claimed that the Pope was literally the Antichrist, and he was burned at the stake for it. I threw that in there because a lot of people today are saying the Pope is the Antichrist. I just wanted to point out people have actually been saying the Pope is the Antichrist for centuries. So that's not a new concept, and I'll even go as far to say as that's not impossible either. And I'm not saying the Pope is, but we don't know. I'm just saying that idea, it's brought up a lot. It's not new. Also in 1557, George Wishart continued what Patrick started after he was martyred. And in 1546, he preached against the Pope and Catholic doctrinal errors, and then they burned him at the stake as well. There's a lot of that in this period. John Knox had the most impact in this time. He was present when Wishart, in particular, was arrested, and he basically literally took up his torch. I mean, he was physically there when he was arrested. And so he also wrote a book arguing that no woman should ever be in leadership. He was very firm on that and blamed a lot of the problems on that, which of course included the secular civil leaders, so there's no queen should be in leadership either. Well, he got in trouble for that. The queen didn't like it. 1560, Knox presented his Confession of Faith and Doctrine work, which is very well known. And then the Catholic Mass was actually declared illegal that same year, in Scotland in particular. So that is an impact. 1558, Queen Elizabeth rises to power, and as compared to Queen Tudor, she was strongly Protestant. Queen Tudor, again, was trying to go back to Roman Catholic. Queen Elizabeth took it back the other direction and was strongly Protestant. I don't have it written down here, but I do remember reading that, I don't think it was Tudor. Never mind. I'm not going to say since I don't have it written down and I don't want to say it inaccurately. But one of these queens essentially hid, and I think it was under Queen Elizabeth, and then she was tried to connive to take out Queen Elizabeth, and Queen Elizabeth found out and then had her executed. After she had given her sanctuary, this is amazing how the aristocratic things work out over there. Anyway, forget that. That was a rabbit hole. I don't have it written down. 1559, the first draft of the Belgic Confession was written. It was 37 articles. I'm just listing that that's what was in it. I don't have the full list here. This was written by Guido de Breze, who was a Dutch Reformed Church preacher. And in 1618, at the Synod of Dort, it was revised. And it was adopted as a doctrinal standard for Reformed congregations. So this was a big year, 1559, for Reformed Christianity, which is more specifically the Dutch Reformed line of Christianity. Because there is more than one line of Reformed Christianity. This is the Dutch version. In 1560, William Whittingham published the English Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible is very well known. The goal of this revision was to redo translation in areas where the source was not the original language. So, for example, if it was being translated from Latin, they redid the translation because you're essentially doing a translation of a translation and you can lose meaning. So they grabbed all the original source they could and changed all of those. Most changes were in the non-Tyndale portions of the Old Testament. So that was Coverdale. So that's where most of the changes were. Now the Apocrypha was still included, but it was in a fully separate section of the Bible. So it was not considered scripture, but it was considered very strongly recommended to read, which is why it was included in the Bible, but not intermixed with the Old Testament. And so, likewise here, what I mentioned here, you don't use the Apocrypha for doctrinal proof, but there's still good learning life lessons, ethics, morals in the Apocrypha. That was their stance with this version of the Bible. In this version of the Bible, the Geneva Bible, there were extremely extensive notes in the margins. And I mean just as many as they could get in the book. And the notes were strongly Protestant. This was the first English Bible to include both chapters and verses. It was the first to use italics to indicate words that were added so that the English could read better. And the physical size was intentionally smaller. If you remember, they had the Great Bible, which had become a standard at this point. I mean, it was this huge, impressive Bible, and not easy to carry around. In fact, in all of the churches, it was usually chained to the wall or whatnot, so it wasn't carried around. So the whole point is they wanted people to be able to carry this Bible in their hand. And so this one was 8 by 10 inches, so pretty close to a standard paper size from today, or even a little smaller than that, depending on which version they got. And so the whole goal of this Bible, I think I'm repeating myself here, was so that common people could buy it, own it, and carry it around. Like, you didn't have to go home and read it in your bedroom. You could actually have it with you and read it. That was the goal. And so this Bible was pretty much the most popular Bible from a sales point of view for around 100 years. So the printing presses were printing this particular Bible more than any other Bible for 100 years, roughly. Bouncing forward 3 years to 1563, Unitarianism spreads anti-Trinity preaching beginning in Transylvania. And of course, Unitarianism, it denies the whole concept of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They eradicate that. There's no such thing as what they teach. And this originally began as a scriptural-based movement, so it was, what do the scriptures say? However, they believed in Arianism, who was actually the first person to bring forth this anti-Trinity concept. And if you'll remember, back in 325 AD, Arianism was deemed heresy by one of the councils, and the Trinity concept was formalized at that point. That's where the Trinity doctrine was actually written up and standardized in the Nicene Creed. And so Arianism in particular teaches that Jesus is a created being. So not omnipotent, omniscient, eternal like God. He was created by God. Now this Unitarianism, it fractures over centuries into a religion of personal reason, works, and liberal theology. So all of those kinds of thinking, all three of those are styles of thought, mix all that together with this concept of God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this is, I'm just going to throw out my opinion, you have this kind of chaos that comes out of it because essentially this movement intentionally has no creed. So when people say, what is it? You're not going to get the same answer depending on where you're at. You could be in one country, go to another one 200 miles away, and they'll give you a different answer of what Unitarianism is, other than the core concept of there's just one God. There's no God the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. One God with one person. There's not three persons. So the future impact, the main reason I wanted to stress this one, people who have held Unitarianism beliefs, like in America, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams held Unitarianism beliefs. They were openly carrying those beliefs. Also in 1563, John Foxe published an updated version of the Foxe's Book of Martyrs. I'd always wondered when it was created, and this was the time of when it was created. In 1559, this was the first version. And it contained very little information of the recent Protestant persecution. It's goal and focus, when it was originally written in 1559, was the very early church, early Christians. Again, the previous centuries where there was the Inquisition, there was examples of that. And specifically, followers of Wycliffe and Tyndale were included in this first version. Now, this updated version included a lot of the Protestant burnings, really, because that was the majority way that they died. If you'll remember from last week, I mentioned Anabaptists in particular. They like to drown them, since the whole concept was wrapped around them choosing a believer's baptism. And so because they considered it heresy, they used water to kill them. Anyway, Fox wrote this book during Queen Mary's reign. And this was another queen who specifically went aggressively after Protestants. So he hid, and he wrote this book in secret within Germany. Also in 1563, the Heidelberg Catechism was penned and came forward. This is a commissioned, reformed composition for the territories near Heidelberg, Germany. It has had multiple authors, but it was primarily Zacharias Ursinus, I do not know how to pronounce that name. That was my best effort. And while it had some Lutheran influence, it was almost pure Calvinist teaching. So the Heidelberg Catechism is used by many Reformed denominations today as one of their core books, if you will, that they will reference in their denomination. 1567, 4 years later, the Puritans become a dominant reform group within the Anglican Church. And if you remember, Anglican just means England. They are synonymous. Anglican, England. And also a reminder, the Anglican Church is a mixture of Roman Catholic and Protestants. It's not fully one or the other. It's a mixture. And admittedly, I'm not going through all the differences here. So the Puritans became this dominant group, and their high-level influence continued through 1660, so a full century, where they were impacting theological circles. And the Puritans in particular loved the Geneva Bible. That was the one that they carried around. And again, remember, you could carry it, so that was the one that they had. And the Puritans began to question practices within the Anglican Church, and they continued in this and they were strongly protesting them and questioning them. And eventually they were expelled because they were causing too much confusion. So the Puritans, back around this time, I don't have the exact year, but two branches came out of the Puritan movement. One was a Thomas Cartwright, and through this particular Puritan became a more Presbyterian or Calvinistic doctrine and church structure. And if you remember, Presbyterian, that just means a church leadership structure, and Calvinism is your doctrine, it's your theology. And then the second branch through Henry Jacob, this was more of a congregationalist belief where each congregation should choose its own structure. So say you've got one in Germany, you've got one in Switzerland. Whatever they write up for their church polity structure or their creed almost certainly wouldn't match between the two areas. It'd probably be close, but essentially write up what your church, your local church body agrees on scripturally. Moving to 1568, the Anglicans published the English Bishop's Bible. Reasons for this revision. Well, the Great Bible notes in the margin, and I say that in quotes, they were strongly Protestant. Well, the Roman Catholic Church didn't like that, and nor did the Anglicans. And so because the Great Bible was critical of both Roman Catholic and Anglican, that was not making them very happy. And they were also getting evidence, if you will, that the Geneva Bible, which was very Protestant, was proving to be more accurate than the Great Bible when you compared them. And so they decided to revise it so to be more accurate. Some of the revisions, they dropped all of the margin notes offensive to the Anglican Church, no surprise. And they did retain the Great Bible verses, and they only departed in the verses where the original languages had been used as sources, and those English translations were more accurate. And they also added a whole bunch of lavish illustrations and calligraphy and the outer bindings of the Bible as well, so it was very visually impressive to look at. And many scholars collectively worked on this translation revision. If you'll notice in all the previous Bible updates, it was usually one person. And there was always helpers. For example, Luther wrote the German Bible, and while he was credited with it, wrote it all down, he met with many other people and had long debates and talks before he would complete a translation. So even though Luther's credited with it, he did work with a group, but most of them, like Coverdale, Tyndale, they mostly did it themselves. This one, it was a collection, and most of them were bishops. And that's why I went into it here. That's why it's called the Bishop's Bible. It was a whole bunch of bishops. Now, the impact of this particular one, in 1571, all Anglican parishes were ordered to switch from the Great Bible to the Bishop's Bible. And so that's why this one's significant, because that was from a society point of view. Now this Bible that had been chained to the walls, well, now it's been removed from the walls, and now there's a Bishop's Bible in its place, which is a slightly visually smaller one as well. However, it did not do hardly anything to overcome the popularity of the Geneva Bible, which still, again, far outsold the Bishop's Bible. Moving forward a few decades, actually, to 1582, Gregory Martin published the English Reims Douay Bible. And this was an attempt by Roman Catholics to create an English translation specifically of the Vulgate. So if you remember, the Vulgate is Latin and revised many times over the centuries. The goal was to combat the wrong English translations that Protestants were using. And I do say that in quotes, because of course this was the view of the Roman Catholics of the Protestant books. Their translations were wrong, so we're going to fix it. That was the goal. And so the rigid translation of Latin that they used, it resulted in numerous unintelligible English verses. And I did include one here because there are dozens like this. So one example here is Psalms chapter 58, verse 9. And this is the Reims Douay Bible, translated from Latin to English. And it says, "Before your thorns did understand the old briar, as living so in wrath he swallowed them." Doesn't make any sense. It's nonsensical. And you can say that compared to the original text that it was written in, which wasn't Latin, it was Hebrew. And I actually read through quite a few verses from this Bible, and I can see why it was not that popular, because many verses, you just read it and you went, huh? And to be clear, that's not just me with this century of English understanding. Again, this is 1582. With that level of English understanding, they found it confusing too. So this translation was just completely not successful because it was confusing. And in fact, most Roman Catholics themselves were just fine sticking with the Latin Vulgate. So it did not sell well, and it phased out very quickly. In 1582, Robert Brown published the first theological exposition of Congregationalism, and the primary difference, hence the name, was that each congregation was autonomous and was allowed to make their own church polity structure. So he actually published a work on it. If you remember, I just spoke about it a few decades earlier about the concept. So the concept was out there, but this was the first published article, if you will, of the concept. Now, starting in 1582 here, there was a lot of churn for this movement, the Congregationalist movement, over the next several decades into the 1600s. And it received very heavy persecution from the Church of England, which again, think about it. They had said, the Anglicans had said that the king or queen was the head of the church, right? And so that's the structure. You know, that's the authority structure. If every congregation is their own boss, well, they're not going to like that. And initially, the Congregationalists were very close with the Presbyterians in terms of a church polity structure, because that's really what the congregation concept is about, is how do you do church government. However, over time, they moved more closely towards Baptists and another group known as the Fifth Monarchy Men. This is actually a group I had forgotten about, the Fifth Monarchy Men. They were pretty strong between 1649 and 1661. They were a Puritan millennial sect. They believed that the fifth monarchy was imminent, that Jesus Christ was going to return and he was going to reign for 1,000 years. And this is another thing. This is another millennial reign in the 1500s that was talked about. And the reason they called it a fifth monarchy is they believe Assyrian was number 1, Persian was number 2, Greek was 3, Roman was 4, and Christ was now number 5. And of course, this is the reference back to the statue that's recorded in Daniel. So this was their belief set, and so they thought the end of days was any day now. And so that was the zeal for their movement. But as you can see, from 1649 to 1661, that movement wasn't very popular for very long. Moving forward to 1606, Puritan leaders Henry Jacob befriends John Robinson in Holland. And in 1620, Robinson's congregation actually arrives at America on the Mayflower. And so you can see how that impacted the United States. Jumping back just a little bit again, 1588, Jacob Arminius begins to preach against Calvinism. And he received his ordination as a priest through a Reformed Calvinist church. And he preached that Jesus died for all, not just the elect. However, he was very quickly pushed out. People very strongly disagreed with him. And you have to remember, this was a time of reform. So people that had become Protestant were actively very proud of breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. And a lot of them, this is sort of my opinion, so take it at that, they weren't in a state to hear another change, because they'd already done a massive change from Reformed Catholic to Protestant, and they were already perfectly comfortable with this Calvinist teaching. And so there was a lot of hostility coming against Arminius with this teaching that Jesus died for all, not just the elect. And he tried to plead his case over and over and over again at his university in Leiden, Holland. And however, he died of stress at the age of 49. 49 is, well, I'm almost 49, so it's not super old yet. Midlife, really. I was talking about myself. 1589, a fifth Catholic patriarch was confirmed in Moscow. And so as a reminder, if you go back to some of our previous classes where we talked about this, what does this concept of patriarch mean? Well, this is a Roman Catholic. Well, this is actually a Catholic term. This was before there was Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox. These patriarchs preceded that. And what they did is they referred to different geographic areas of the world that basically collectively, had a Catholic influence there. And so Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem were the four that had been around for centuries. Well, in 1589, it was formally confirmed that the area around Moscow was now a fifth Catholic patriarch. So essentially there was another leader put in that position, a patriarch. So after the fall of Constantinople, if you'll remember, last week I also mentioned this, we opened this entire section with the fall of Constantinople, and I believe it was 1453. So that happened, and a lot of the people moved to Russia, specifically the Moscow area. And so the influence was going on there for many decades, well over a century. And so that's how this area came to be another patriarch. And of course, this was seen as a third Rome. Rome, of course, was the first one. Constantinople was referred to as a second Rome. Now, Moscow was referred to as a third Rome back in 1589. Moving forward about a decade to 1598, Theodore de Beza publishes his last edited version of Beza's Greek New Testament. This person was considered to be the successor of John Calvin, and he spent decades working on this edited version. I mean, that's a long time. He had multiple revisions while he was working on it, but this was his last update. And again, why was it updated? It was an updated Greek because it had, again, more updated sources, and the Latin Vulgate was used not for source translation, but for comparison to see how they compared accurately. Again, they did not fall back on the Vulgate if it was different. They fell back on the other sources. So the two new sources here, so the majority of the sources is Stephen's Greek New Testament, unchanged, and a codex, I don't know how to pronounce that, Bezae, a 5th century Greek and Latin manuscript with most of the 4 Gospels plus Acts and 3rd John. And I believe this Codex Bezae is also in a museum today. We still have it. And then another source was the Codex Clamentinus, another 5th century Greek and Latin manuscript with all Paul's epistles. So just to be clear, that means that this version had these writings side by side in Greek and Latin, so they could see them written that way. And this particular one was all of the Pauline epistles. So between these two sources, they had a huge chunk of new sources for the New Testament. And this also defines a list of the Old and New Testament canon, the books of the Bible. It was missing Philippians and Thessalonians. This is as recent as 1598. It was missing Philippians and Thessalonians. And it included the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, Acts of Paul, and Revelation of Peter. And again, those 4 books had been argued for literally centuries up to this point. The Greek updates were a comparison of all 3 sources plus applying clear Greek grammar, so making it easy to understand with the common Greek reading of that day. And they also added a large addition of personal annotations and notes. In 1610, followers of Arminianism wrote a manifesto called Remonstrance. I actually don't know how to pronounce that. Remonstrance. And this recorded the summary of the teachings of Jacob Arminius. Just a reminder, Christ died for all, not the elect. That was the core teaching. So this was all of his teachings, not just that one. Now, a foreshadowing of this particular book in 1610. This would influence John Wesley of Methodism in 1700, so almost a century later. And Wesley would directly combat the Calvinism tulip doctrine later, and Wesley traveled to America, and he was a traveling horseback preacher. So again, you can see how very quickly this is going to start influencing the United States. And 1611, a big year, the King James Bible was published. So the trigger for this version of the Bible, the Puritans sent King James I a list of grievances with the Anglican Church. If you remember, they were kicked out, and they asked questions, and the Anglican Church just expelled them after a while. And so through multiple discussions and years, little had been resolved, if anything at all, from their perspective. And there were many, many arguments over differences in translations. So the goals of this particular version was a translation of the entire Bible, so Old and New Testament, from original language sources as close as possible. They used Jewish commentaries plus Hebrew text. They used Beza's Greek New Testament and all of Tyndale's English New and Old Testament, plus Coverdale's and the bishops. So the comparison of all of these. And Erasmus, yes. I didn't write that down, but yes, they did use Erasmus as well. So it was both Beza's and Erasmus Greek New Testament. There was absolutely no margin notes. That was one of the goals. So a lot of references. So like if you're looking at one scripture, hey, you can look over here for a cross-scriptural reference. So it includes that, but none of the notes. And it was, again, a goal was to become a replacement of the bishop's Bible used in Anglican parishes. So these were the goals for why they began the work. King James I was very heavily involved in the process and had final approval of everything. But to be completely clear, he did not cross-review the scriptural translations. He wasn't a theologian. He didn't do all of that, but he did approve what was there. And he rather focused on the organization and layout and what was included, but again, he didn't do the translations. Multiple university scholars performed those retranslations. I think it was around 4 dozen. I was not able to find an exact count, but it was somewhere around 48. And after these retranslations, it was followed by full review and approval of multiple bishops. So it was a very extensive, exhaustive, translation work with multiple people and review. And it had to be approved as well. And that was long before it even reached King James. So all of that happened prior to that. The King James Bible was a massive success as most people accepted it immediately. The Puritans did not. That was one group that openly did not, and they stuck with the Geneva Bible. This is a move. So moving to now in 2023, current day and age, many people complain that the English language that is in there is very hard to understand. However, going back to 1611, with the way people were speaking back then, it was widely considered an English grammar wonder. It was so easy to read, and it was how people talked back then. It was confusing to us today from time to time because we don't talk that way, but back then it was crystal clear what was being said. And so back at that time, you have to remember, this was the age of the Enlightenment. So understanding was very important to people. They didn't want things muddled or confusing. So good English prose, which basically means good writing, clear and understandable writing, was important. And so this translation was considered exemplar, like an example of good English writing at that time. So that's one of the main reasons why theologians, historians, that sort of thing, think it was such a success, because it was so easy for people to understand in English. Also in 1611, Thomas, I do not know how to pronounce that either, Helwys, wrote up the Baptist Confession of Faith. This was the earliest known, so not necessarily the first person to create this denominational statement, but the first one to write it up that we know of. It had 27 articles, and this was a small group that actually broke apart from a Mennonite church. And if you remember, the Mennonites are a group of Anabaptists, I believe from Holland, the Netherlands area. They were renamed a Mennonite, and then this Baptist group came out of that line of Protestant churches. These were known as the General Baptists, with Arminian beliefs that Christ died for all, and they also agreed with the believer's baptism, so the Anabaptist beliefs. And in 1613 was the very first congregation that declared that they were General Baptists. That was the first actual congregation that's recorded in history, and it was in London, England. In 1620, a North American settlement brings Christian beliefs. So this is, Columbus has found the New World, and colonization is happening for many decades here. In 1620, you start seeing Christians groups, in particular Protestant groups, going over to North America. And this whole thing could be covered like in weeks of discussion, so this is exceptionally high level, just very briefly mentioning it. You've got the separatist Puritans, which were known as the Pilgrims. That's how we talk about them today. They landed in Plymouth, and they were also known as Congregationalists. And their very first year there, 100 people arrived. Their first winter, 50 of them died. Half of them died. It was a brutal, brutal first winter. But after that first winter, they exploded in growth. Following winters were fine and all of that, but it was a very, very brutal first year for them. The Puritans, another group of Puritans, landed in Rhode Island, Maryland, and New Hampshire. Some Roman Catholics were in Maryland. Lutheran groups landed in Delaware. Presbyterians were focused in Long Island. Anglicans were centered around Virginia. And if you remember, this is where John Rolfe married Pocahontas. That was Anglican. And Roman Catholics were, I have listed them twice. And then Quakers were in Pennsylvania. Again, that's just super, super high level. American history can talk about a lot more of that. In 1630, the dust had settled, and the King James Bible was officially the English Bible translation. So remember, 1611 is when it came out. And, basically a couple decades of hemming and hawing and fighting and resisting, but for the most part it was accepted. And by 1630, everybody was talking about the King James Bible. Everybody except the Puritans, I believe. They were still using the Geneva Bible. 1631, I put this in here because I never knew about this one. And I thought this was kind of funny. At the time it wasn't funny, but in hindsight I think it's kind of funny. So in case you've never heard of it, this is where the infamous Wicked Bible was published. Again, I'd never heard of it. A lot of people call it the Adulterous or Sinner's Bible even, which of course sounds like this horrible thing. Well, just in case you've ever heard of it, this is what happened. So the compositors, again, the printing press people, when setting up the plates to do the printing, because it was all manual, you set up the printing and then you printed the pages and et cetera, right? Well, you have to realize by this point, for centuries, they'd been making Bibles over and over and over and over again. Well, they set up a plate wrong. Specifically in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, where it says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." They forgot the word "not." So it became, "Thou shalt commit adultery." And that's the only error in the entire Bible. But it became known, obviously that's a huge doctrinal difference. And of course it makes the whole point of the Bible, it's infallible, and now you've got a version of the Bible that has a very wrong teaching in it. And so it became known as the Wicked Bible, and they tracked it down, burned all the copies, that sort of thing, so nobody would be confused. So if you ever hear of it, that's what it was. Again, I'd never heard of it. And I didn't write it here, but the two people who were in charge of it, they, of course, were brought to court, and with all of the people burned at the stake, I pretty much expected that's what would have happened to them too. They were not burned at the stake. They were, in fact, vindicated that it was just a mistake. However, they were the sole printing press at the time that had the exclusive rights to printing the King James Version of the Bible. They lost those rights. That was their punishment. So instead of being burned at the stake, they basically lost their livelihood, but it's better alternative than this whole burning at the stake thing constantly for everything. 1636, Roger Williams founded Providence, Rhode Island. In fact, he bought it from the natives. He did not take it by force. And in 1635, a little bit backstory, he and his family were kicked out by the Puritans in Massachusetts. And he had strong beliefs and advocated for religious freedom, separation of church and state, and fair treatment of the Native Americans. Hence why he bought the land from them instead of taking it or trying to trick them. And this particular colony, every religious faith was welcome in Providence. And again, there's way more you can say, but that's high level. Also in 1636, the Harvard University was founded. It was a Protestant Christian higher education school for advanced learning. Not what it is today, but that is how it started. 1638, the first particular Baptist congregation. If you remember on the previous page, it was General Baptist. This is the first particular Baptist congregation, very first one. And they were distinct from the General Baptist group, and they were rigid, hardcore Calvinists, and especially that Christ only died for the elect. I think that's why they threw in the phrase particular, because they really focused on that specific concept. Essentially, the L in TULIP, limited atonement. 1646, the Westminster Assembly drafts the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is very well known today among many denominations. This was written for the Anglican Church of England, and it was modified and used over time by Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and the particular Baptists. A year later, George Fox begins to speak publicly as a Quaker, and he founded the Religious Society of Friends, again, AKA a Quaker or a friend. So if you think Quaker, where'd that word come from, it was supposed to be synonymous with a friend based on their very name, Religious Society of Friends. There's no line in the sand for when this particular belief mindset was formed. It grew over time. So 1647 is not necessarily the year or the line in the sand, but this is when he began to speak publicly as a Quaker. Some of the ideas that were being preached: there is no such thing as clergy. Anyone can be called to ministry leadership by the Holy Spirit, and this included women and children. A church polity structure was unnecessary. Disdained calling the this was George Fox specifically here. So not Quakers, but George Fox in particular. He disdained calling a congregation building a church. Calling this a church, couldn't stand it. Drove him nuts. So he called it a steeple house, because the church is the ecclesia. It's the people. It's not the building. He just couldn't stand calling a church, the church building, a church. So he was very, very critical on that one. And so even to, the Quakers for decades then would refer to churches as steeple houses, even if they didn't have the steeple look, the tall. Again, that's why they were called a steeple house, because that's how they looked at the time. And so sort of to fight that kind of concept and get people out of that mindset, George Fox intentionally and as much as possible held services outside. He loved to do them in the fields. Nice wide open spaces. And he also stressed the personal Holy Spirit guide of the individual believer. And this was in stark contrast to clergy telling you what you needed to do with your life. The priest coming up saying, you're going to be this, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. They really focused on empowering the believer to live with the Holy Spirit and connect with God. 1648 was the Peace of Westphalia, and this was a formal end of persecution decree. And we are now hitting the end of this period. This is why it's ending in 1648. So it's the Peace of Westphalia. Also, a thing that ended in this year was the end of the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. This was a battle, literally, between Catholics and Protestants. It was primarily in Germany, so that was the focus of the battleground area, but it was also the surrounding areas. It's really to the degree, I don't know if I have it in here, but it was this close to be calling World War I, because that's how many people were fighting in it. So obviously it's not called World War I historically over time, but that's the level of involvement of the nations. So it's very close to have been called World War I. Rome, France, Sweden, Holland, Denmark, Switzerland, Bohemia, and Bavaria. And in this war, Germany lost 1/3 of its population, because again, they were the fighting ground. So the skirmishes and battles and all of that were on their land, most of them. And it went for 30 years. So the result at the end of this, Protestantism was declared valid. It is not heresy. Protestants were allowed to hold civil offices. So you have to realize, even if they didn't burn you at the stake, they would excommunicate you. You can't do anything. You can't do civil offices. You can't hold jobs. basically a different way of trying to force you to stop. All lands that were Protestant in 1624, so that was still during the war, but everything that was Protestant at that point was allowed to remain Protestant. Again, we're at 1648 now. This was the conclusion. Switzerland and Holland were recognized as independent Protestant states. And if you'll remember, Switzerland is the Swiss Reformed. They do have their own line of Reformed teaching. And then Holland, the Netherlands, that's where the Dutch Reformed, and still to this day, that's where the Dutch Reformed come from. And so that's the end of this period. And so, as I said at the beginning, this page 20, I titled it My Ponderings. Normally, I wouldn't even print that out. I would just talk at this point. So I just want to be clear. This whole page is my opinion, and take it as such. And I even say that, take it or leave it. So if you disagree, okay, that's fine. But these are my thoughts in studying this particular period. To this day, Protestant and Catholic do not agree on multiple topics. So they did not solve anything back in these 2 centuries. They solved some stuff, kind of, but not really, because we're still fighting about it today. However, suffice to say, I already know that, and I already mentioned. So basically, there's Catholics and Protestants who are going to disagree with some of my other thoughts in here, because as we saw, you have all these other threads of Protestant beliefs. I mean, we covered Quaker, Baptist, Puritan, Congregationalist, all these different kinds, all Protestant. But you wonder how everybody has some disagreements. Well, this is really, this Reformation area is when it started spreading out with all these different sub-beliefs. One thing I did want to stress again, and I admit this one is just, it's a rub for me. This is probably the 3rd time I've mentioned it. In 95 AD, Clement of Rome submitted a letter to the Corinthian church. And he changed the face of Christianity, really, to this day. It is not considered canon, never has been considered canon. By some people, sure, but on a large scale, in any Bible printing ever, has it been considered canon? No. In any council, has it been considered canon? No. So it's not canon, it's not doctrine. What did it introduce? In 95 AD, you have to remember, the only one left was John, Apostle John. He was still around. Everybody else was gone, all the original disciples. But John, of course, was very old by this point. So this teaching was introduced in 95. 2 big changes: apostolic succession and separation of clergy versus laity. This apostolic succession, that it has to come through Peter, that one just makes me upset, because that's supposed to still impact us today. The belief that the Pope that we have today is still through the line of Peter. It was broken multiple times over the centuries, and it's not biblical. And that's why I stress this is not canon, but a lot of people still treat it like it's canon. And so I boldface it here. Look at the damage that this belief system caused over 1,400 years. The Roman Catholic Church, even Roman Catholics, I don't know how they couldn't disagree themselves. The Roman Catholics today, I don't know how even them couldn't disagree that between 1000 and 1517, Roman leadership was a mess. Again, that's when the triple pope thing happened, double popes. It was not good. And again, this is my opinion coming out here at this point. This is what you get when you treat these 2 teachings as doctrine, because they're not from the Lord. And so a reboot back to the early church was necessary to get away from this apostolic succession and the separation of laity from laity. And I don't have it here, but I'm just going to throw it out. We are all a priesthood of believers. There is no separation of clergy and laity. It is not scriptural. That one I'm very strong on, and I'll have a full theological, scriptural debate with anybody who wants to argue it. And then in apostolic succession, I just want to also be clear when I argue this one, this is all supposed to be based on everything's through Peter. I don't want to make it clear. There is still such a thing as authority, God-given authority. That is still a thing. I'm not coming against that. But this apostolic succession is just not accurate. Another concept that I wanted to point out through my research, the signs and wonders of believers is recorded significantly less than previous church periods. And I'm not saying it didn't happen, but when you're reading through all the writings, I mean, when you were studying the early churches, I mean, it was just pages and pages and pages and pages of signs and wonders, and I mean, just left and right. In this area, you can see how the intellectual impact of that time impacted what was recorded. So that's kind of my opinion, making it perfectly clear that's my opinion. I think the signs and wonders probably still were happening, but they weren't getting the focus they used to, therefore they weren't being written down as much. Purely my opinion, and just take it as such. But I did notice that there was just a definite lack of recorded signs and wonders during these 2 centuries. Now, many wonderful acts of service, that was definitely everywhere. And of course, the more mortal persecution and just great faith of people, but specifically signs and wonders, just not recorded as much. Another concept that I thought about for this particular era, notice that in previous periods that we've covered up until now, it was the world against Christians. And so that was the norm for over 1,000 years. It was the world against Christians. And all of a sudden, what do we have here? And just to be clear, it didn't start in this period. It started back in the previous period that Josh covered with the Inquisitions. What we have now is Christians killing Christians. So it didn't really start in this period. Again, it started in the previous, halfway through the previous period. But in this period, it was rampant. Christians versus Christians. Catholics versus Protestants, and Protestants of Lutheran versus Arianism versus Anabaptists. Keep going and going. And the other thing, and again, this is entirely my opinion, use of fear to intimidate and control. And that's me just speaking plainly. Yeah, that's not God. That is not how God works. God does not use fear to get you to do what you want. No, again, this is a whole theological debate. There's the fear of the Lord, right? I'm not going to go down that rabbit trail. That is not what this means. I'm talking the fear that you have when you're sitting there, they've got a burning stake over there, and they're saying, we're going to kill you. That is not the same thing as the fear of the Lord. That's mortal fear of imminent death. The fear of the Lord, really, again, we can go into this a long time, that's respect. That's what that fear means. And again, that's even high level. You can go to it more than that because we're talking about an omnipotent God. It's more than just respect, but that's the first word I'd use. It's really more about respect of your Lord. And so this intentional torture, burning people alive, that's just pure cruelty. People will say, well, God's going to send people to hell, right? Well, I'm not God. None of us are God. If whatever God chooses to set up, or, how he does his judgments at the end, he's the creator. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And it doesn't give any of us the right to torture people that we think are heretical or wrong. There is no scriptural stance for that, for us to torture people to death. I think it was Tyndale. I forget which one it was. He was at least strangled before he was burned to death. Okay, so at least that one was quick. But burning people alive, that one just twists my stomach because that is just cruelty. No matter how much you disagree with the person, torturing them to death is that's not God. And you see a lot of that in this century. I mean, thousands and thousands in 200 years. However, another thing from this period, believers were reconnected with God on a spiritual level and in mass. So as the title says, it was a reformation. It really was a reformation. And yes, the Reformation, everybody immediately thinks Protestants. Yep, Reformation. Well, it also reformed the Catholic Church to an extent. I'm not saying it fully reformed it, but it really did kickstart the Catholic Church. And they had actually what was known as what was the phrase? Counter-reformation, but that was from a Catholic point of view. So it got them to re-examine what they did. So there really was change in the Roman Catholic Church, again, to a degree. They tried to lock down all of the corruptness in the clergy, and I'm not saying they fully succeeded in that, but at least they did make significant changes in that area. However, what it did in mass whether you were Roman Catholic or Protestant or whatever, it drove people to re-examine the tradition of the previous centuries, and I put this in bold, return to the Bible and not tradition. To actually read the Bible for yourself. That's huge. Read the Bible for yourself, not what your clergy priest tells you. Read it for yourself. What does it really say? This was huge. And this caused believers to re-engage. And again, this is my point here. I say wrong. It's not my job. It's the clergy's job. That's my number one problem. There's more than one. But my number one problem with the separation of clergy versus laity, this is human nature. What happens if you separate clergy and laity? What happens if you really believe that? It's not my job. It's the pastor's job. That's not my job. It's the evangelist's job. And so all laity gets a free ride. All I got to do is show up, listen, and then I can go home. That's what happens with clergy versus laity. The laity does not engage. And what does Jesus say? All of these things I do, you will do, and greater will you do. He was not talking to clergy. He was talking to believers in him. We don't get a free pass to just not do anything. It's not all the pastor's job. It's not all the apostles' job. We are all supposed to engage. And so this Reformation, it caused believers to re-engage. People desperate to understand what the Scriptures really said. I mean, at the very beginning, there was a person living 200 yards from where the Pope lived, and he was openly coming against the Pope. Wow. And again, remember, this is a period where they were burning people for coming against the Pope. He was coming against the Pope. And what he was coming against them about was right to come against them for. So again, that whole page, they're just my opinions. I am done. Questions, comments?